Welcome, everyone. I'm Ben Cotton. I am the Fedora Program Manager at Red Hat. This talk is your bug tracker and you. If this is not the talk you expected, there are other rooms where your talk you're expecting might be. I like to start off every talk with a little bit of just basic housekeeping. So I use he, him pronouns. The usual disclaimers apply. I just introduce myself as being a Red Hat employee who works on the Fedora project, but this is all my opinions. It doesn't actually reflect what Red Hat or Fedora thinks. Unlike other talks I've given, I agree with all of my opinions this time, which is kind of cool. This talk is under the Creative Commons Attribution Share Alike 4.0 license. Please feel free to do with it what you like, subject to the terms of that license. If you have kind things to say, there's my Twitter handle. It's also on the bottom of every slide. I'd love to hear your feedback or the funny lines that you thought were the best. And if you have unkind things, you are, of course, invited to keep those to yourself, because nobody's going to be harder on this talk than I will. And we'd like to keep questions, and not a question, but really more of a comment at the end. I will probably talk a lot faster than I did when I rehearsed this, so we'll have plenty of time. I do want to put in one shameless plug real quick. Much of the content that you will see in the next hour is also in this book that I just published. I happen to think it's pretty great. But I will not talk about it anymore. I'm not here as a sales pitch. What I am here to talk about, I'm going to talk about why you want to have a bug tracker. That will be a very short section because hopefully it's going to be pretty obvious to all of us. We'll talk about what you want to track, how you can pick a tracker, and then how to triage, close, and analyze bugs. What we won't be talking about are fixing bugs. This is very much not a how you interact with the bugs and fix bugs in your software talk. This is about the project or program management level sort of tracking of bugs in the aggregate. So we really won't be talking about individual bugs almost at all. And we won't be talking about specific bug trackers. I have opinions about some of them, but mostly all bug trackers are terrible in their own way. So what we'll be talking about is how you can pick one that's appropriate for your community. So with that, why do you have a bug tracker? To track bugs. I mean, that's what's on the label. But realistically, bug trackers are the cornerstone of building an open source community. You can have a lot of things, mailing lists, chat programs, forums, all kinds of stuff, but you need to have a bug tracker. Because a bug tracker is the way that you communicate with your users at the most basic level. People tell you, here are the things that are broken in your software, and you're like, oh, gee, thanks. But it's also how you coordinate with contributors. If the project is more than trivially sized, you probably have multiple people working on it, and you have multiple bugs, and so you don't want to all be accidentally fixing the same bug. That's not a super productive use of your time. It also, your bug tracker is a historical record, so it builds a source of information about the project. It's not a particularly consumable historical record, but the raw data is there. I kind of liken it to like an archaeological dig. Right? You have the experts that go out and actually dig up the artifacts and analyze them, and then turn it into consumable history. And your bug tracker is the same way. You're not going to learn something by having everyone go through and read all the historical bugs, but for the people who are wanting to do the bug archaeology, they can put together a useful history of the project. So I think we're hopefully all in agreement now that we should have a bug tracker. So what is it that you want to track in your bug tracker? There's some kind of obvious things like the type. Is it a bug? Is it a request for enhancement? Is it a question? Is it spam? You want to be able to know what these things are. You want to be able to track the status or state. Is it open? Is it closed? Is it in progress? Is it on testing? There's lots of different things that you might use, but at the basic level, is it open or closed is a really important thing to be able to track. You want to be able to track the type of closure. Did you fix it? Did you say, nope, we can't fix it? Did it go end of life? Is it invalid? Things like that. We want to be able to track the impact. And the impact is sort of how important it is to the user. Like, is it something where it's like, oh, this is kind of annoying, but I took the time to report the bug? Or is it like, hey, this is going to delete all of my videos of grandma's 95th birthday party? Those are useful things that we'll talk about more in a little bit on how you would use that, but that's an important field to have. And then priority is, basically the internal, how quickly are the developers going to work on it? And you can be really tempted to have priority be like, a very strict ranking of this bug, then this bug, then this bug, but that falls apart pretty quickly at scale. When you have 100 or 1,000 bugs, you're not going to sit there and individually rank them, but having categories is important. You want to think about, track the version. This isn't applicable to all software projects, but most of them have some sort of release system where there are versions. And you might want to know, is it in version 2 or version 3? Because how you deal with that might vary. Some projects, like Linux distributions, for example, are very large and have many components. Or it might be an application where you have like a web layer and a database layer. So if you have those different components, you want to know, be able to track which part it's in, because that helps you kind of route it to the right place. And also, the platform might matter. So, operating system and architecture. Sometimes bugs are very specific to one of those. And even when it's not, as we'll talk about later, just knowing that information can be really useful in terms of what you learn about your community. You also want to track timestamps. And the nice thing is timestamps usually just sort of happen automatically in almost every bug tracker that still exists in these days. But it is useful to know how old is this bug? Is it a 5-year-old bug? Maybe it doesn't actually, the bug report isn't valid anymore because it got fixed and nobody updated it. Things like that. You want to know who reported it. And again, this feels kind of obvious, but like you need to be able to reply to that person. And so the way you do that is to know who it came from. And then an assignee who's working on it. And there are probably more things that you can think to track. We've gone through a lot. A lot of them seem very obvious. But there might be other things that are sort of specific to your community that you think about. The really important thing here is that you want all of those things that we talked about in the last 3 or 4 slides or whatever to be separate fields, not like in the content of the bug. Because it turns out that if you try to get people to write machine parsable free-form text, they're going to be really bad at it. You just can't, even with some natural language processing, you're going to have to really work if you have to extract it. So having each one as being a separate field really makes it a lot easier for you to do things with that metadata later on. And if you're lucky, the tracker provides all these fields, or at least the ones you need already. So let's talk about picking a tracker. These are some things, like I said, I'm not going to talk about specific bug trackers, but these are things that you want to think about as you're deciding what to use. If your community already has a bug tracker that you're using, cool, just keep using that, because the cost of switching is probably going to be way more than the cost or the benefit you get from switching. But if you're starting a new project, or something is forcing you off your old bug tracker, these are things to think about. So you want to think about authentication and accounts. This is both, do you want to be able to use your project's own authentication system? Large projects often have their own account system for email addresses and various internal tooling and stuff like that. So it'd be nice if you can use that in your bug tracker too. It's just one less account for people to manage. On the other hand, a lot of your users might not have a project account because they're not really involved in contributing to the project. So you might want to make it so they can log in with a local account, or use GitHub or GitLab or Facebook or Google or some other authentication provider to be able to log in. You want to think about if they have API libraries. So almost every bug, I didn't even put it on here because it feels super obvious, but like being able to interact with an API is great. If there's already a library for it, then that makes it a lot easier for you, because you don't have to write it. You just, import, Python Bugzilla, and you can do things with Bugzilla in your Python without having to re-implement everything. You want to think about its status as free and open source software. And this is a question for you and your community to decide. Some communities absolutely have to have free and open source software. They will not use anything else. And if that's the position of your community, that's fine. Other communities don't care, or maybe have a weak preference for FOSS software, but whatever bug trackers you're looking at, you want to make sure that whatever your community values, your bug tracker reflects that. Similar with hosting, most projects these days, when they're starting, they don't want to host their own infrastructure anymore. And I'm a big fan of not hosting your own infrastructure unless you have to, because generally that's not the expertise of your community. You're not here to write your own version control system and then develop your cool widget. You're here to develop the cool widget. But some projects do have a preference or a technical need for being able to self-host. And if that's the case, again, you want to pick one that allows you to do that. There are some things regarding safety and confidentiality that you want to consider. Hopefully your project has a code of conduct, and part of having a code of conduct is being able to enforce that, which means hiding or deleting comments that are abusive or otherwise violate the terms of participating in your community, and moderating or blocking the accounts of people who are frequent violators. But there's also, there might be a need to submit a private bug or comment or attachment because, like, say it's, you're attaching some logs or a core dump to help the developers figure it out. You want to make sure that the tracker that you pick supports that. Big fan of all bugs should be publicly viewable, except for the rare exception when they shouldn't be. So we talked about a whole bunch of different things that you would want to track, and the odds that a tracker has all of them built in are pretty low. So think about, do you need customizable fields? Can you create, like, hey, add this field to be this, and set, like, have it be a date or a Boolean or whatever. You want to think about the access controls on the metadata. So basically all of the things we were talking about in the previous section. Who can change those? Some bug trackers, basically any authenticated user can change the version or change certain other metadata, but not everyone can change the subject or the bug report or comments or things like that. Again, this is something where there's not a right answer, there is your community's answer. There are things that you might want to make it so that people can change some of the basic metadata, because you have 20 different people all experiencing the same problem, and that way one of them can say, oh, it's still in this latest version too, and you don't have to wait for the reporter or an assignee to make that change. But there are things you might not want anyone to change unless they're sort of inside the project or things like that. Things like linking to version control or other bugs. If you make a git commit, can you reference the bug in your bug tracker and have it automatically make a comment? That's super useful, but a lot of times projects may not care, or the systems may be separate enough that you don't want to plumb that together. But for things like Fedora, we use Red Hat Bugzilla, and we can a lot of times we add links to like an upstream tracker, because it turns out the bug isn't in the Fedora package, it's in the upstream project. So we want to be able to track that, but also refer to the upstream bug, because that's where it's probably going to get fixed. Bulk updates. Those are a thing that we'll talk about closing bugs. If you have to do them one at a time, it gets super painful. So having the ability to, either through a scripted API or ideally like through a web interface, makes your life a lot easier when you have to make bulk changes. Things like milestones and epics can be really useful if that's how your community does development. Being able to have that in the bug tracker and assign bugs to a particular milestone are helpful. If your community doesn't use it, you may not need it and you don't care. You also want to think about the reporting capabilities of your bug tracker. And we'll talk about this more a little bit. But being able to just generate some tables of like bug count by version, being able to do that really quickly is useful. Being able to graph bug counts or whatever over time can be really helpful. You'll probably end up doing your own custom reporting, but if it has some stuff built in, that saves you some time. More things to think about. Does it have a default assignee? So you might want that for particular components, it assigns it to a specific person, and then that person is the assignee until they pass it off or somebody else claims it. Or you might be like, we don't want a default assignee, we want it to be explicitly unassigned because that communicates that, hey, nobody's looked at this yet. Again, this is not the right answer, just your community's answer. Does it support multiple assignees? One of the cool things about open source software development is that the person who is assigned to a bug is often not the person who actually comes in and fixes it. And most people just don't bother to update the assignee because they just rather fix the bug and move on, which is cool. But also, like if your project does like pair programming or things like that, you might have multiple people working on it, or you might have like a development assignee and a QA assignee, or a documentation assignee. So if that's the way your community works, you want to make sure your bug tracker can support that. Being able to mention other users is super helpful. You might be like, hey, so-and-so, can you take a look at this? Or you might be like, we don't want that because that's a vector for harassment and it's not worth the trouble. So again, think about that. And then being able to watch or subscribe to bugs or to components where you don't necessarily want to interact with the bug. You just want to get updates. You want to see what progress is being made or see if somebody commented on it. Sometimes you might want to subscribe other people to a bug without their permission, or you might want to not allow that. We do that a lot in Fedora, and it's actually really helpful to just be able to add somebody. But sometimes it does get abused, and people tend to delete Bugzilla email a lot more than I wish they would. So one other thing to keep in mind is that whatever you end up picking as your bug tracker, you're not going to just use it as a bug tracker. And that's not just the request for enhancement that you get, but it's also, you might just use that as like a Q&A system so that people have questions about how to use your software and they come to the bug tracker because that's what's there. And so you use that to interact. You might use it for like internal governance to conduct votes on who gets the commit bit, or how you make decisions on spending money in the project, or whatever it is. So just sort of keep in mind that no bug tracker ever gets just used as a bug tracker, sort of in the same way that spreadsheet software is used for way more than just spreadsheets, and presentation software is often used for like poster design and all sorts of graphical design stuff that really shouldn't be. Your bug tracker is going to be the same way. All right, so you've picked out your bug tracker. It's cool. People are now submitting bugs. Now you need to figure out what you're going to do with these bugs. So we're going to triage your bugs. And on the first pass, really what we're doing is we're just sort of sorting them into making sure they're going in the right place. So there are some questions that you ask as you go through each bug. The first question is this a bug? If it's not, does it belong in your bug tracker? If you're using your bug tracker as also a way to track requests for enhancement, then cool, you tag it the right way. But if it's, if it belongs somewhere else, then you either move it there or you tell the other person, hey, this isn't where it belongs. Please file a whatever in this system. you want to ask, is it a duplicate? This duplicate bug reports never accurately reflect the number of duplicate bugs because it's just at a certain scale, it's really hard to know the state of every bug. So you hopefully can like search and maybe it'll even suggest, hey, this bug looks like that one. But otherwise, you just kind of do your best. Like, you know, mark it as a duplicate if you know it's a duplicate. You can ask, is it a security bug? We'll talk more in like how we prioritize on the next slide. But you know, you might do certain things with security bugs. You know, tag in your security expert, or you know, just add a particular label to it or something so that you can track those sort of things later. Is it filed in the right place? So, you know, if you're developing Python and somebody comes and reports a bug in some application that's written in Python, it's not actually a Python bug, so, you know, you send it to the appropriate project. Similarly, you know, if it's a bug filed against your project, but it's actually, the bug actually is in the upstream library that you're using, you probably want to direct people toward that because you're not going to be able to fix it yourself. Then you ask, is the bug reproducible? If it's not reproducible, that's okay potentially, but it's definitely a lot easier to fix reproducible bugs because then you can tell that you fixed it. If it's not, you might ask for more information, and we'll talk a little bit more about like potentially closing those later. And then, does it say what happened? You know, it broke, not helpful. But if it actually says what happened, then people can start working on it. And if not, you go back to the reporter and say, okay, so what was it that actually happened? What did you expect to happen? Those kinds of questions. So now we've got everything sorted into the right place. So now we're going to start figuring out which ones to work on first. And no matter what rules you have in your community, people are going to work on the bugs that are interesting to them and within their skills. But you can at least sort of generally set a priority that indicates to the community what it is, you know, what's sort of should be worked on first. And so, like I said earlier, like, it's really tempting to try and like assign a numerical score and, you know, have a very strict ranking. That's not how people work. So low, medium, high is a good priority scheme. So basically, you want to go through these questions, and the sooner you get to a yes, the higher the priority. So the first question you want to ask is, can physical harm result? And you might think, well, this is software. What physical harm could result? But it turns out that software usually runs on hardware. And hardware can do things like get really hot and cause fires. Or there was an example a few weeks ago where a chess robot grabbed a 7-year-old's finger and broke it. So if you have a bug that causes something like that, that's a really important thing to fix. But it's also, you know, software is everywhere in our lives now. And so if you have an application that's, you know, used to get support for domestic violence, or, you know, make other reports where if the presence of that report gets into the wrong hands, it can cause real-world harm to people. So these kinds of bugs are always the ones you have to fix first. So if you answered no, hopefully, then you move on to the next question. Does it cause data loss or corruption? People will be very reluctant to forgive your project if you have deleted the video of baby's first steps, or pictures from somebody's wedding or something like that. If a company is using your software and they lose their customer records, they're not going to keep using your software. And if you answer no, we move on to, does it permit unauthorized access? So this is can be sort of a duplicate of the can physical harm result, but it also just, does it turn your laptop into a Bitcoin miner, things like that. These are, again, important bugs to fix. And then, does it reduce accessibility? And I think, and I'm just as guilty of this as anyone else, but in open source, we do a really bad job, generally, of making our work accessible and our communities accessible. And so anytime we make this worse, that's bad. So really, these first 4 questions, I would kind of put in the, these are the high priority things. If you answered yes to any one of those, it's a high priority bug. So the rest of them are kind of maybe medium priority, and again, it's very fuzzy, but is the default configuration affected? Because most people aren't going to touch the defaults, or they're going to lightly touch the defaults. And so if the bug only appears in a very heavily customized installation of your software, it's not that it's not important, but it's going to affect a lot fewer people. Similarly, if there's a reasonable workaround, then you might be less likely. I guess this one really should be, is there not a reasonable workaround? And reasonable is in italics here because if the software is designed for casual users, telling them to go download this patch out of our Git repo and recompile while standing on your head and make sure you're holding down the Enter key at the same time, that's not really a reasonable workaround. So if it's something that your average user isn't going to be able to do on their own, that's, again, more likely to affect more people, and you need to fix it sooner. Does the bug affect all platforms? So if it's only on Windows 3.1 running on i286, probably not a big issue for you in 2022. But if it's like all of 64-bit hardware, that could be a problem. If it's all Linux distributions or just any operating system, it increases the number of people that are probably affected, and the sooner you want to fix it. And then the last question I have here is, does it embarrass you? And this is not in the sense of, boy, I get embarrassed anytime I write a bug in my software, but it's, like, do you have a splash screen that has your project's name spelled wrong? Like, it doesn't actually affect people's ability to use it at all, but when the tech press does a review, they're going to be like, wow, these guys can't even spell their own project. So that's kind of embarrassing. If you answered no to all of these, then it's probably a low priority bug. So now that the bugs have been prioritized, your community can go through and get all of them fixed, and everything is great, and we'll talk about closing bugs. So this part is a little contentious, I think. There are definitely varying opinions on how to close and when to close bugs. My take is you totally should. If you disagree, I look forward to your talk. But for now, we're going to go with this. So the reason that people will disagree about it is closing bugs sends a clear signal of intent. This bug is not going to get fixed. For whatever reason, don't expect this fix. And clear communication is very important. It also makes the bug tracker easier to scan, because if you have 1,000 bugs and 90 or 900 of them aren't going to ever get fixed, it makes it really hard to scroll through and see the ones that you actually care about. On the other hand, closing bugs when the bug report isn't fixed makes people angry. And I know that because every 6 months I close 5,000 to 7,000 Fedora Linux bugs, and I see people on social media and on the mailing list and in the bug say, you never fix my bugs, I'm giving up. And sorry, but we do have to do that at some point. And it's okay for people to be angry, but some people would rather avoid that conflict entirely. You might also have contributors in the community say, well, I was going to work on that someday. I will get to it, I promise. But they can reopen it in that case if they were going to get to it. And there's also people that say that having it open bug reports represents a catalog of known issues. And that asterisk is there because it's known and also reported. Not every known bug is actually reported in your bug tracker because sometimes people just don't bother. And I do have a lot of sympathy for that argument, but I think listing the known issues for major things is just put it in the release notes. We don't need to keep the bugs open forever. So now that you all agree with me that we should totally be closing bugs and it's great, how do we do that? Well, obviously, you can close it when it's fixed. That's the happy case. Everyone loves that. If it's a duplicate or invalid or spam, as soon as you make that decision, determination, close it. No need to keep spam bugs open forever. If the bug is missing information, so you don't know what the bug report actually is, it can be closed. If you can't reproduce it, you might close it. You might leave it open and see if somebody else comes up with a reproducer. If the version that it's reported against reaches end of life, you say, well, we're not going to fix bugs in this release anymore, so why bother keeping the bug open at that point? And as a more general case of that, if you know that you can't or won't fix it for whatever reason, and this could be, just you've come to rely on this buggy behavior in other parts of the software and fixing it's too complicated, or if it turns out to be like the space bar, holding that down heats up the CPU, like in the XKCD comic. But once you've made this determination, again, close it. But the important thing is that you want to have that communication ahead of time. People don't want to be surprised by this. You can't be like, oh, you know what, we decided that we're going to close all the bugs. That's not a great way to engage with your community. Now, you can have the policy and clearly communicate it in a bunch of different ways, and people will still miss it. You can't show up at everyone's house and be like, here, by the way, here's our bug closure policy. But you can at least make a good faith effort and do your best job of getting that out. When you close the bug, you want to explain why. Like, don't just close it and walk away. Say, we're closing this because the version is end of life. We're closing it because we can't reproduce it, whatever. And then similarly, you say, if you think it should be reopened because it's still valid against a supported version, reopen it with the new version. Or, hey, if you can provide a way for us to reproduce it, give it that. And ignore the complaints, because like I said, people will be upset when you close bugs that you don't fix. And it's not that you don't care, but you can't take it personally because this is what you have to do to keep your bug tracker manageable. So the process is going to vary by the closure type. So I talked earlier about some where once you make that determination, there's no value in leaving the bug open, just close it. But you don't want to be too aggressive with things like missing info or can't reproduce, because just in the same way that all or most of your contributors are doing this on a volunteer basis, your users are possibly using the software on a volunteer basis. Certainly, they're under no obligation to ever report bugs to you. And as much as it doesn't feel like it sometimes, they are doing you and your project a favor when they report bugs. So give them the same grace that you would want. If somebody reports a bug and the next day, like, why isn't this fixed? You're going to be mad. So if you go and say, oh, I can't reproduce it, closed, they're going to be mad. So give them some time. Understand that they may not be waiting patiently, just begging their email to have a notification that you said you worked on it. A week sort of feels like a minimum. 2 to 4 weeks seems a little more generous because we all like to disconnect from our computers sometimes, or sometimes life just happens. So give people time. Maybe mark it with a missing info tag, and then do a search for anything that's missing info and hasn't been updated in the last 4 weeks. Okay, that's when you go through and close it. All right, so we've gone through and we've closed all the bugs because they're either fixed or they're never going to get fixed. And so now we want to do a little bit of analysis on them. And why do we want to do analysis on them? Because it allows us to learn about the user community. It's easier than a well-constructed survey because it turns out doing a good survey is really, really hard. Especially when you don't have, like, you don't know who's using your software because people can just download it from wherever, and they might not even get it directly from you. And so how do you know to get the survey in front of them in the first place? And most open source projects don't want to put in a bunch of phone home reporting because that's sort of antithetical to a lot of people's reasons for choosing open source software is they want to have that control. They don't want to be phoning everything home to the upstream project. On the other hand, because it's easier, it's like less scientifically valid, but for the most part, you're not going to like present this at a scientific conference where you have to have a lot of rigor. We're just trying to learn some basic things so we know something about our user community. And so what we can do is we can learn some approximate things like what percentage of people are using this on Windows versus Linux versus BSD, which components are being used, how quickly are our new versions being adopted. And all of this depends on bugs being equally distributed throughout the project, which is probably not true. But as a first approximation, it can be really useful. If you see that 75% of your bug reports are coming from people running on ARM architecture, then either that's really popular in your community, or there's something about the ARM architecture that is particularly buggy for your software. Either way, that's really useful to know. And then knowing like how quickly people adopt new versions of your software might inform how you decide to do your release cycles. So, in Fedora Linux, it's every 6 months, and we see pretty rapid ramp up in the number of checks to the repo on release day. Like it shoots up pretty quickly, and then it holds pretty steady until it sort of trails off at end of release. With enterprise Linuxes or Linuxes, you see a much slower adoption rate. And so people, they're more conservative. They're taking more time to test things and stuff before they really start deploying it. So depending on if you're targeting like, community desktops or enterprise systems, you'll see different rates, and you'll want to adjust accordingly. You don't want to have your software reach end of life when people are finally starting to use it. That's not super helpful. You can also learn things about your project. So you can learn about like bugs over time. Are we getting more bugs? Are we getting more high priority bugs? Are we getting more security bugs? And this can be really useful because you can, bug reports aren't bad. Bug reports are a sign that people are using and engaging with your software. So an increase in bug reports could just be that more people are using it, and that's actually a really good thing. But if you see that your number of bug reports is increasing faster than your contributor community is, that can be a sign that you need to try and recruit more contributors so you're not overwhelming people. You can track things like time to resolution, so basically delta between when the bug was closed and when it was opened. Ideally, that's pretty low and on a downward trend. And if it's not, you can look at, all right, do we need to do more to try and like triage bugs so we can close the obvious closures early? Do we want to try and have more testing so we're not introducing bugs in the first place, things like that. And you look at things like bug severity, because if you're seeing a big increase in their high priority bugs, that could be an indication that something is going wrong in your development or your testing process, and you want to try and catch those before they get out. But there are things you can't learn. One of the things that I would really like to know is how quickly are people getting a response? Like how quickly are we actually acting on the bug? It turns out that's really hard to do unless you sit there and like manually go through for each bug and say, all right, this is the actual like first real comment on it, and how that was 3 days after it was opened. Okay, we'll mark that. In a previous job, I did that for our support engineering team, and we had like a dozen or so tickets come in a week, so it was pretty easy to do. When you're getting thousands of bug reports, you can't manually do that. So it'd be really nice to know that but you really can't reliably calculate that. You also can't figure out who the best or worst bug fixers in your community are, because remember we talked about the person who's assigned to the bug might not be the person who actually fixed it. And frankly, I don't think there's a lot of value in trying to do that, because what's going to happen is if somebody shows up as the worst bug fixer or just not the best, that's going to be really discouraging to them as a contributor. And it could just be that they're mostly doing other things that are valuable to your community, like writing documentation or doing design or going to give conference talks. So if you're trying to do that, think about your motivation and maybe find a different way to reward people for fixing bugs. You also can't learn affiliations. You might really want to know, hey, what companies are filing bugs and using our software, because maybe we can go hit them up for some sponsorship money. And you can tell that some, but it's not reliable. There are a lot of people at Red Hat who work on Fedora, and they do their Fedora interactions with a personal email address in Bugzilla because they want to keep their Fedora contributions and their day job contributions separate, which I totally respect. But so like, people sometimes ask me, how many people at Red Hat work on Fedora? And I say, I have no idea. And I'm certainly not going to be able to tell from the Bugzilla email addresses. A lot of people who are participating on behalf of their employer probably don't use their employer email address because they maybe have been doing other stuff in Fedora, and they don't want to have a separate Bugzilla account for every different hat they wear. There are other ways that you can learn this sort of information, but the bug tracker is not a reliable one. So this is another fun one. You can challenge your assumptions, because at one point I was looking through some bugs and I was like, man, everybody just marks the severity as urgent because of course it's urgent. It's the most important thing to them. That's why they came and filed the bug report. And then I looked at the data for about 15 releases. It turns out most people don't even set the severity. These are Fedora Linux 19 through 33 bugs. Almost 75% of people didn't even set the severity when they filed the bug report. And of those that did, only a small percentage said it was urgent, which is like, this is actually about the distribution you'd expect. But I was very uncharitably assumed that people did that the wrong way. So you can think you know something, and then you analyze the bugs, and it turns out you don't know anything at all. So when you're analyzing bugs, you want to look for things like trends that will cause a change in behavior. If it's not going to change something that you're doing about how you develop or test or support the release, then why bother? It can be useful, like fun to just know cool facts, but it's not particularly useful. When you're analyzing bugs, you usually want to ignore duplicates unless you're like looking at how many duplicates do we get, because that can sort of be a clue of how hard is it for people to find existing bug reports. If you're seeing a big increase in duplicates, that probably means you need a better way to make it so people can tack on to an existing bug report. And basically, you always want to ignore spam, because you're really not ever going to do anything with like, oh, this is how many spam bug reports we got. Unless you're just going to completely disable the bug tracker, you're going to get spam. It's on the internet. When you're thinking about it, though, you think about percentages or raw numbers, and which one tells the story that you're actually trying to figure out. Going from 10 to 100 bugs between releases, that's a big number. Going from 1,000 to 1,090, that's the same difference, but it's, percentage-wise, it's a much different change. On the other hand, if, like, say, you have one security person on your team who needs to sign off on every security bug, going from 10 to 100 is a really big deal, and going from 1,000 to 1,090 is also a really big deal, because that's still 90 more bugs that one person has to deal with. I generally try and go with percentages for most things, just because, we might have, one release might have 10,000 bug reports, the next one we have 17, and so it's really hard to make comparisons between the two unless you're dealing in percentages. But there are certain times when you do want to be able to look at the raw numbers. All right, so how do you actually do this? A Jupyter Notebook and Pandas, those are great tools. I really like, that's what I do for Fedora Linux bugs because I can check it all into a Git repo. I can share it with the community. They can make pull requests to improve things. Like when I recently discovered that I was calculating percentages wrong because basic math is hard, that's something that somebody else could have noticed and fixed for me. R is another great tool. You can use a spreadsheet. We talked about how spreadsheets get abused. I don't think spreadsheets typically have enough power to really do some of the cool filtering and things that you want to do. But that's an option if that's what you have available. But being able to make tables and graphs is really helpful because then you can really get a feel for the trends and like what the bugs are telling you. So I have like a half-hour talk of exploring Fedora Linux bugs that I gave at Nest with Fedora last year. So that's available if you want to watch it. I'll be doing an updated version next week at Nest with Fedora. So if you want to sign up for that, it's free and it's online. It's our annual contributor conference. And it'll be a lot of the same stuff as in this one. I'd actually love to go over it with you now because I think it's really neat. But it's a 25-minute talk at very fast talking, and we have about 14 minutes left. So I don't see how that would work. But as promised, we do have plenty of time for questions, or more of a comment than a question, really. So if you have either of those, I'd love to spend the next 15 minutes talking with you about it. Yeah.
I think I understand that Fedora bugs are largely Red Hat's Bugzilla. Is there any plan to move to something more modern?
So the question is there a plan to move Fedora Linux bugs to something other than Red Hat Bugzilla? That's a very loaded question. RHEL Engineering has gone on the record as saying that they will be moving RHEL bug trackers to Jira instance that Red Hat has. Candidly, I have no interest in trying to convince the Fedora community to move to Jira. One, I'm not super familiar with it anyway. I don't feel particularly fond about it. But also, there's a lot of people in the Fedora community who would be very hard-pressed to accept a proprietary solution. That said, as far as anyone has told me, Bugzilla will continue to exist indefinitely. I don't always find out about things ahead of time, but I said earlier that keep using the bug tracker that you have. Bugzilla is really awesome in a lot of ways. It's also very painful in a lot of ways. If we were starting Fedora Linux today, I do not think I would pick it. But we have 36 plus releases of history in there. And so just being able to go through and do some of this historical analysis release by release is really helpful. There will be some discussion in the Fedora community about potentially moving at some point, but it's more of a what is it that we're looking for, and if Bugzilla meets what we need, then I think we'll stay there.
So something with bug trackers, something open source is, obviously a lot of it's pick and choose, right? Like everyone always talks about Arch Linux and how you pick and choose different kinds of components and what you want. And I know earlier you described like all bug trackers are terrible in that way, specifically because you have one package that might have this, this, and this thing, and then the other package might have X, Y, Z. Why is there any no bug tracker really that's able to go and pick and customize and really just be one for the community then? Because I'm hearing a lot of proprietary and stuff, and I'm sure there's open source bug trackers. Like, why is there no one filling that specific niche? I'm curious. Or why is there so much hesitancy?
So if I can summarize this correctly, I think the question is basically, why are there not more open source bug trackers that can be easily customized to fit the exact needs? Is that a fair characterization? Okay. So I think one, bug trackers just aren't an interesting thing for most people to work on. A lot of open source is people trying to scratch their own itch. And yes, everyone has a bug tracker, but nobody wants to use fundamentally, nobody really wants to use the bug tracker. Like, we understand that it's a necessary thing, but I've not talked to anyone who's like really excited about it. And then there's also just, like you mentioned, Arch is a very flexible and customizable distro. That's also why it's not necessarily the best for newcomers, right? Because with the flexibility and customization comes a lot of complexity. So there are a lot of open source bug trackers out there. There are a lot of proprietary ones. I think there's just a general trend towards using things like GitHub or GitLab, where you have both your code repository and your issue tracking all in one place, which simplifies a lot of things. And especially for small projects just getting started, being able to use software as a service is a really big benefit to them, just from the being able to get started on the thing they actually want to work on standpoint. There are obviously reasons that a community might choose to not use proprietary or open core software as a service. Sure.
Just a comment on GitLab. A lot of the distros and KDE, all of them use GitLab, and I think we've found a lot of that is there. We've already built the technology to move 22 years of bugs from Bugzilla over into GitLab. So if you're a mature project, that's something worth looking at. We have fairly good relations with GitLab as what we have found is our software is much better testable, and just overall much better than not using Bugzilla. It's not Bugzilla exactly. It's that there's independent pieces there that we have to work to make them integrated, rather than something that's been designed to integrate this. That's I have other topics, but
Okay. And just to summarize the question for the recording, or the comment, it was basically that a lot of open source projects like GNOME have moved to GitLab in recent years and have been able to migrate their historical data. And I know GNOME is very happy with their move to GitLab, and I've heard the same from other communities. Any other questions, or more of a comment than a questions? Yeah.
Maybe just to add one thing to that, I think GNOME also saw a pretty big spike in contributors after moving to GitLab.
Yeah, so the comment is GNOME saw an increase in contributors after moving to GitLab, and I think that's one thing that's really powerful. I don't know how much of that is because it's GitLab versus Bugzilla or whatever other systems they were using, but using a tool, and I think that's why GitHub in particular has become sort of the default place for a lot of projects, is that there are a lot of people who already have accounts there and they're already familiar with using it, and so the barrier to new contributors is pretty low. And that's something in Fedora that we've tried to work with people on, is lowering that initial barrier of contribution, because as a 20-year-old distribution, we have a lot of historical things that aren't necessarily the way we would design it today, but are very difficult to switch away from. And so people have to get used to a lot of different tools or different workflows that they might not be useful to or used to. And so, having that additional complexity and unfamiliarity does make it harder to get new contributors started. All right, Sheree, go ahead.
Another comment regarding bug statuses. One of the things in the community that we get hammered for is Thank you. One of the things to point out too when you're constructing statuses for for bug statuses. GNOME is an interesting project because it really interfaces with the enthusiastic Linux crowd, which can have very strong and sometimes toxic opinions. And so when we get because there's always a difference of opinion between what the community does and what the project does, and a lot of times I had actually worked on this because the bug statuses is important because they actually trigger people. So in Bugzilla we have something called won't fix, and if you just imagine what that means, won't fix, screw you, is really what it says. So a lot of times we had to change things into it. So instead of won't fix, out of scope, right? So that's something really important is you don't put things when you close them that trigger people and create emotional responses, because they go back and then because of the addition of social media, they will use that to hammer their project on a regular basis because they're looking to, punish the project for one reason or another. So it's one of those really crazy things that we had to deal with, is people who get obsessed with their contributions not being accepted because they think it's so important to them. So that's another bit. And one last comment. Emojis. So in GitLab, when we moved to emojis, it's used for racist comments. So instead of racist comments, they put an emoji of a monkey, or they do plus things to say, look, 500 pluses on this bug report. It must be important. And it's like, it's out of scope. So those are other things to think about, especially when it comes from a racial or equity kind of thing. Is it can be used to punish maintainers and other commenters.
Thank you. All right, we have time for one or two more questions or comments or completely unrelated asides. I'll entertain whatever, it's fine. Yeah, go ahead.
So maybe this one is also kind of opinionated question, but like if closing bugs is controversial and counting bugs also is almost meaningless because they mean different things. So why can't we leave them open? Like, why is there a need to close a bug that's actually not addressed? The user is still unhappy. Leave it open forever, and you can manage expectations by saying, if someone wants to work on this, patch is welcome.
Yeah.
What do you think about it? Yeah.
So that's certainly a viable approach. I do think that, at a certain stage, like you're not going to fix it, and I think sometimes it's easier to rip the proverbial Band-Aid off and just say, look, this isn't going to get fixed. Stop holding out hope that it's going to. It also does make bug analysis a little easier. One thing I didn't mention in the slides is that I really don't do any analysis on the Fedora bugs until after releases reach end of life, because at that point everything is definitively closed, and we can say sort of this is an unchanging set. And that said, if your bug tracker is useful to your community, or if you have some way to like hide or deprioritize ones that you really don't expect to get fixed, it's not always time-based. Like the bug that came in yesterday, we're probably not going to fix that. Let's move it sort of down the pile. If you have a way to indicate that could be a valid thing for keeping bugs open longer term or indefinitely.
Another corollary question is like, how do you handle bugs that are present in upstream and you think it's responsibility of upstream to fix? So Bugzilla, like the Fedora Bugzilla, doesn't have a good way to link bugs to other bug trackers.
Bugzilla, Red Hat Bugzilla does now have the ability to link to some upstream bug trackers that it specifically knows about. The approach I would like to see is that that bug gets referred to, sent upstream, whether it's the maintainer opening a bug on behalf of the user or the user going and directly doing it. This is sort of my dream world, that everyone would have sort of a concierge to do that, and then being able to track that until upstream closes it and we pull that new release in. In practice, a lot of people will just mark it closed upstream and say go to the upstream tracker for it. I don't know that there's necessarily neither way is particularly the right way. It's there's arguments to be made for on both cases, but yeah, a lot of bugs that are filed against Fedora Linux are entirely upstream bugs. Like, there are things that the maintainer might fix, but a lot of times, like I maintain a few software packages. I'm not a developer. I probably can't fix most of the bugs that would be reported against them. The best I could do is refer them to the upstream project.
Yeah, and for example, you when it's fixed upstream, you can close the bug after you create a package with that fix. So that's when it's up to you. So you have to create a package, new release of the package with the fix, and then you said it's fixed in this package, but you don't close. If it's fixed upstream, you shouldn't close it. You should close it when you created a new package with that fix. And also, you close bugs also because triaging with a bunch of open bugs that you're not going to fix is harder. And it has happened to me that I'm triaging and I've seen that bug, and I say that bug is not going to get fixed. So just close it and say something nice, because you can get trashed.
We had one hand up in the back of the room, and then I think we're at times. I know there's a half hour between sessions, but I do want to be respectful of everyone's time here.
Hopefully quick. I'm curious if Fedora has a process, or if you have thoughts on rolling over bugs to new versions as they come out. So the bug comes in on a version, and then new versions are getting created maybe before the bugs are getting fixed. So what is the process you guys use for that, especially with regards to the analysis that you do?
Okay. So what we do is, we close the bugs when the Fedora Linux release goes end of life. So we don't automatically roll them forward. There's a case to be made for that. I think in a smaller project that might make sense. And a lot of times we do have people, after we close it end of life, reopen and say, oh, this is still a problem in the latest release or whatever. But at the number of bugs we have, if the individual maintainers don't stay on top of it and move that bug forward to another release, it's just really hard to do that at scale. One thing we do is several weeks before the end of life closure, I run the script, and it puts a comment on every bug, says, hey, this is going to be end of life on this date, and so if you're still seeing this on one of the newer releases, please update it, and then it won't get closed. In an ideal world, we'd have a lot of people who could go through and triage and double check all those bugs. I would love to have a team of a dozen people who just went through Bugzilla all the time and did that stuff. That's really boring and thankless work, and it's hard to get people to do that, unfortunately. Okay, well, thank you, everyone. If you do have more questions, I can talk to you later. I'll hang around for a few minutes, and then I will be in the Fedora booth probably a good portion of tomorrow. And also, my Twitter handle is there, or you can find my email. Just search for Ben Cotton Fedora, and it'll show up pretty quickly. So I'd be happy to have more conversations with you later. But thank you so much for your attention, and enjoy the rest of SCaLE.